The war was turning. By late 1943, the skies above the Pacific had become a graveyard of aluminum and ambition. Japan's air superiority, once absolute, was fragmenting under American pressure. In Tokyo, the military hierarchy understood one truth: technological advantage was the only remaining card left to play. On a rain-soaked airfield near Nagasaki, Flight Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto prepared for what should have been a routine courier mission. The briefcase handcuffed to his wrist contained specifications for the Sakai engine, Japan's most advanced aviation power plant, capable of pushing the new Zero variant to speeds that American pilots had not yet witnessed. The documents were encrypted, classified, and absolutely irreplaceable. Yamamoto had been briefed by 3 separate officers. The stakes had been made clear. This envelope was worth more than a battalion. He never made it to Shanghai. His transport aircraft, a modified Nakajima Ki-34, encountered mechanical failure over the East China Sea. Radio distress signals were sent. For 3 days, silence. The military bureau assumed the worst: pilot error, enemy interception, or the simplest tragedy. The sea had claimed another man and his burden. What Tokyo did not know was that Yamamoto had survived. The wreckage drifted. A British minesweeper, HMS Sharpshooter, spotted debris floating near the patrol line south of Taiwan. Protocol dictated salvage operations. When the crew pulled the waterlogged briefcase from the wreckage, they found a body still tethered to it: Yamamoto, dead for approximately 2 days, his uniform soaked through, his face already marked by salt and exposure. The briefcase, however, was sealed. The encryption remained intact. Within hours, the discovery was cabled to British Naval Intelligence in Singapore. Within a day, it reached London. The specifications were forwarded to Rolls-Royce, then to the Air Ministry, and finally to a small technical team at the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough. What they found inside would rewrite the trajectory of the air war. The Sakai engine blueprints were not merely advanced. They revealed engineering solutions that British designers had theorized but never achieved. The fuel injection system was elegant. The supercharger geometry defied conventional wisdom. The metallurgical tolerances suggested that Japan had solved problems in thermal stress that were still unsolved in British workshops. For weeks, the discovery remained compartmentalized. Only a handful of men knew. The official record listed the wreckage as unidentified debris. Yamamoto's name was buried in a secondary report filed under routine naval losses, but in the laboratories of Rolls-Royce, the implications were impossible to ignore. The engine could be reverse-engineered. Components could be adapted. Within 6 months, Britain would possess knowledge that might accelerate its own fighter development by years. Across the Atlantic, American liaison officers were briefed. The reaction was identical: shock, then calculation. Yamamoto had died thinking he was preserving Japan's last technological edge. Instead, his accident had handed that edge to the enemy. The irony was never recorded in any official document. It lived only in the memories of the men who knew, and most of them took the secret to their graves. Back in Nagasaki, Yamamoto's widow received notification that her husband had died in service. No explanation, no details. She was given a pension and told to grieve quietly. She never learned that his final mission had failed, that his briefcase had been recovered, or that his death had inadvertently accelerated the very defeat her nation was now racing toward. The rain fell on Japanese airfields through 1944 and into 1945. The new engines that might have changed everything never materialized in sufficient numbers. The technological advantage that Yamamoto died trying to protect was already in foreign hands, being studied, analyzed, and reproduced. History does not often pause to acknowledge the men whose failures become the architecture of their enemy's success. Takeshi Yamamoto received a posthumous commendation. A small shrine was erected in his hometown. His name appeared in no history books. The secret remained buried until 1962, when declassified British records were released to selected historians. By then, everyone involved was either dead or too old to care. The war was ancient history. The irony, profound and melancholic, became a footnote in a technical journal that almost no one read. The engine that Yamamoto died protecting would eventually be copied, adapted, and integrated into the RAF's Rolls-Royce Griffon series. It gave British fighters a margin of performance that, in the closing months of the air war, proved decisive. One man's accident, one sealed briefcase, one moment of chance in an ocean that claimed millions. The aero engines still speak of it, if you know how to listen. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this story. We're interested in knowing how far these documented accounts travel, and at what moments of the day or night they reach you. The briefcase sat in a climate-controlled vault beneath the Royal Aircraft Establishment for exactly 48 hours before anyone dared to open it. Security protocols demanded verification of authenticity, clearance from 3 separate departments, and the presence of a senior metallurgist, a naval intelligence officer, and a representative from the Air Ministry. When the lock finally gave way, the room fell silent. The documents were in Japanese, technical drawings rendered in meticulous detail, each blueprint cross-referenced with performance calculations, stress analyses, and material specifications that suggested months of refinement. But what struck the assembled engineers most profoundly was not the sophistication of the design. It was the handwriting in the margins, annotations, corrections, dated entries spanning 18 months. Someone had been iterating on this engine continuously, pushing it forward through dozens of incremental improvements. A young engineer named Richard Hartley, 28 years old, trained at Cambridge with a reputation for geometric intuition, was assigned to lead the reverse engineering effort. His first task was to translate not just the language, but the philosophy behind the design. "They've solved the combustion chamber geometry in a way we haven't," Hartley told his superior, running his finger along a cross-section drawing. "The volume-to-surface ratio here, it's reducing heat loss while maintaining pressure efficiency. We've been chasing this for 2 years." The metallurgical specifications were equally instructive. The Japanese had developed a nickel-chromium alloy composition that allowed higher operating temperatures without catastrophic grain boundary failure. British metallurgists had theorized this was possible, but they lacked the industrial capacity or the willingness to sacrifice production timelines to experiment at scale. Over the following weeks, Hartley and his team began a systematic deconstruction of the engine's logic. They built scale models. They conducted thermal stress tests. They consulted with production engineers at various aircraft factories to assess what could realistically be manufactured. The conclusion was both exhilarating and sobering. The Sakai engine represented a genuine technological advance. It was not revolutionary. It did not defy physics or introduce entirely new principles, but it demonstrated that Japan's aircraft industry had solved a series of interconnected problems that British engineering had addressed only partially or not at all. "If they had time," Hartley wrote in his classified report, "and if they could manufacture these engines in quantity, they would possess a significant performance advantage in high-altitude combat by mid-1944. But Japan did not have time, and more critically, Japan could not manufacture them in quantity. The Strategic Intelligence Division quickly understood the implications. Japan's technological answer to Allied air superiority was theoretically sound, but practically impossible to implement at scale. The enemy was not ahead. The enemy was innovating faster, but operating within a collapsing industrial infrastructure. The British decision, made at the highest levels of the Air Ministry, was straightforward. Adapt the most feasible components, integrate them into existing engine programs, and accelerate fighter development accordingly. Hartley was tasked with leading a small team to modify the Rolls-Royce Griffon engine, already in late development, to incorporate three key innovations from the Sakai specifications: the combustion chamber geometry, a modified supercharger impeller design, and a revised fuel injection timing system. The work was extraordinarily demanding. Each modification required testing, failure, redesign, and retesting. The metallurgists had to source materials that could withstand the new thermal stresses. The production engineers had to retool manufacturing processes that were already stretched to their limits. But by early 1944, the first prototype Griffon, with integrated Sakai-derived modifications, was ready for flight testing. The pilot was squadron leader James Crawford, a battle-hardened Spitfire veteran with more than 200 combat hours. The test took place on a clear March morning at Farnborough, with Hartley watching from the ground with a clipboard, a stopwatch, and the peculiar anxiety that comes from knowing that years of work are about to be validated or destroyed in minutes. The aircraft lifted off smoothly. Crawford took it through the standard test profile: climb rate, level flight at various throttle settings, dive characteristics, recovery behavior. 22 minutes elapsed. When Crawford landed and climbed from the cockpit, his expression said everything. "It's responsive," he reported, his voice carefully neutral in the manner of test pilots trained not to overstate findings. "The climb rate is noticeably superior. The engine runs clean through the mid-altitude band. No vibration anomalies. Handling remains stable." Hartley allowed himself the smallest smile. The engine that Takeshi Yamamoto had died trying to protect had been decoded, analyzed, and adapted. In less than 6 months, it would begin appearing in operational RAF fighters. The technical intelligence analysts filed their reports. Yamamoto was never mentioned. The Japanese officer remained what he had always been to the Allied war effort: a name in a casualty list, notable only for his accidental contribution to his enemy's advantage. In Tokyo, the military hierarchy never understood why their technological secret, their last hope for air superiority, seemed to materialize almost simultaneously in British fighter designs by mid-1944. The explanation drifted at the bottom of the East China Sea, held forever in the cold grip of a briefcase and the body of a man who was simply trying to do his duty. By June 1944, the first operational Spitfire Memke Tutin variants, incorporating the Sakai-derived engine modifications, were entering squadron service with RAF Fighter Command. The designation was bureaucratic and unremarkable. The performance was not. Squadron leader Peter Denham was among the first to fly the new variant in combat. His previous aircraft, a Mk2 Spitfire with a standard Griffon engine, had been a capable fighter, but the new variant was categorically different. The climb rate was exceptional. The acceleration in the mid-altitude band, where most combat occurred, was notably superior to anything he had previously flown. "It feels like you're flying something the enemy doesn't have an answer for," Denham reported after his first combat sortie, in which he had engaged a Focke-Wulf 190 and achieved a decisive advantage in vertical maneuvers. By September 1944, RAF Fighter Command had equipped 12 squadrons with the new variant. The results were subtle but consistent. Combat loss ratios improved. German pilots reported aircraft with unexpected performance envelopes. The Luftwaffe response was confusion and concern, but no clear understanding of what had changed. Intelligence officers in Berlin theorized variously. New fuel formulations, different supercharger designs, even entirely new aircraft types. They could not know that their own enemy's advantage had originated in Japanese specifications recovered from wreckage in the East China Sea. The irony of war is rarely symmetrical. In this case, it was absolute. Japan's technological innovation had been intended to slow Allied momentum. Instead, it had accelerated it. A nation fighting for its survival had inadvertently armed the coalition that would destroy it. No official record ever acknowledged this. No British report stated explicitly that Japanese engine designs had been incorporated into RAF fighters. The technical lineage was deliberately obscured in classified documents. Security protocols demanded compartmentalization. But among the engineers and pilots who knew, those small circles of men who had handled the blueprints, conducted the analysis, or flown the resulting aircraft, the knowledge persisted as a kind of melancholic awareness. War produces these paradoxes constantly. They rarely surface. When they do, they are usually classified, filed away, and forgotten. Richard Hartley continued his work at Farnborough through the remainder of the war. He was never publicly credited for his role in adapting the Sakai specifications. No commendation appeared in his personnel file. When the war ended, he returned to civilian engineering work, eventually helping to design post-war commercial aircraft engines. He died in 1987 without ever giving a formal interview about the Sakai project. His widow found his wartime journals among his effects. They contained technical sketches, performance calculations, and a single entry dated March 1944. The enemy has shown us something we needed to see. It is difficult to feel grateful for this knowledge, and yet gratitude is perhaps the only honest response. Squadron leader Denham survived the war and retired from the RAF in 1952. In his later years, he occasionally gave talks about his combat experience. He never mentioned the Sakai connection. When asked directly by a military historian in 1981, he deflected. There were many technical improvements during the war. Most of them came from hard work and accident in equal measure. You could not separate the two. The official history of the RAF's engine development during World War II makes no mention of the Sakai blueprints. The design innovations are attributed to Rolls-Royce engineers working independently on theoretical problems. In a technical sense, this is not false. In a broader sense, it erases the accident that catalyzed everything. By 1962, when the British government released declassified documents regarding the discovery of the Japanese briefcase, the revelation generated minimal public interest. The war had been over for 17 years. Aviation technology had advanced beyond recognition. The men involved were aging or deceased. A technical footnote in a historical document held no narrative power. The story of Takeshi Yamamoto and the briefcase that changed the air war remained buried, not in classification, but in obscurity. If this story surprised you, make sure to leave a like to support the channel. In 1975, a British archivist named Eleanor Hartwell was cataloguing materials in the RAF Historical Records Facility when she encountered a sealed folder marked Saki Engine Project, Technical Lineage, Restricted. The classification had expired in 1970, but no one had bothered to open the folder in the interim. Hartwell, with proper clearance, read the contents, detailed technical reports, correspondence between Rolls-Royce and the Air Ministry, performance comparisons between the original Sakai specifications and the modified Griffon engine. There was also a photograph. It showed a young Japanese officer in dress uniform, his name written in careful English on the back. Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto, recovered 1943. Hartwell was not a war historian by training. She was an archivist, a woman trained to organize, preserve, and occasionally interpret the fragments of history. She understood that this folder contained a narrative that had been administratively buried for 32 years. She conducted preliminary research. She discovered that Yamamoto's death had never been officially explained to his family. She found that Richard Hartley, who had led the reverse engineering effort, was still living, retired in Sussex. She located Squadron Leader Denham, now 72 years old, living quietly in Devon. Hartwell made a decision that would have been professionally unthinkable a decade earlier. She began interviewing the surviving participants. Hartley was reluctant but willing. Denham was more circumspect, but eventually provided his account. She even attempted to contact Yamamoto's widow through the Japanese government, but discovered that she had passed away in 1968. Over the course of 18 months, Hartwell assembled a comprehensive narrative of the Sakai project, from the initial discovery through the engineering adaptation and eventual operational deployment. She wrote it as a technical, historical paper intended for academic publication. The paper was rejected by 3 major military history journals. The editors offered consistent feedback. The narrative was compelling, but it complicated the standard historical record. It suggested that Japan's technological efforts, though ultimately insufficient, had influenced Allied engineering in ways that conventional military history had not acknowledged. More problematically, it positioned a Japanese officer's accidental death as a pivot point in the war's technological trajectory. One editor wrote, "While the research is rigorous, the implications are uncomfortable. We must be cautious about narratives that suggest the enemy made positive contributions to our technological advantage. The public is not prepared for such nuance." Hartwell's paper remained unpublished. She filed it with her personal archives. In 1989, she donated her collection to the Imperial War Museum, where it was catalogued, preserved, and for all practical purposes, forgotten in the vast accumulation of wartime documentation. The folder sat there undisturbed for another 20 years. In 2009, a military historian named David Chen was researching British-Japanese technological espionage during World War II. While conducting routine archival work at the Imperial War Museum, he encountered Hartwell's paper. He read it with the kind of astonishment that comes from discovering something that should have been common knowledge, but has somehow escaped historical attention. Chen's research confirmed Hartwell's findings. He published a paper in the Journal of Military Technology in 2011, titled Unintended Allies, Japanese Engine Design and British Fighter Performance, 1943-1945. The paper generated modest academic interest. It was cited in several subsequent scholarly works. It did not appear in popular histories of the air war. Most people who studied World War II, even those with serious interest in aviation history, remained unaware that a Japanese officer's accidental death had contributed, however indirectly, to Allied air superiority. The reasons for this historical silence are complex and perhaps inevitable. Wars produce narratives of opposition and victory. The idea that the victor's advantage arose partly from the vanquished enemy's technological contribution disrupts these narratives. It introduces ambiguity into a historical moment that most people prefer to remember as clear-cut and morally unambiguous. Takeshi Yamamoto remained what he had always been to history, a name attached to a date, a rank, and a final disposition. The fact that his death had inadvertently altered the course of the air war was relegated to the archives, preserved but unseen, documented but unknown. The rain continued to fall on Japanese airfields through 1944 and 1945. The new engines that Yamamoto died trying to protect never materialized in sufficient quantities. The technological advantage he fought to preserve had already been transmitted to the enemy through a briefcase recovered from wreckage. History is not always written by the victors. Sometimes it is simply filed away, waiting for someone curious enough or patient enough to open the folder decades later. The war ended 79 years ago. The aircraft that flew the modified Griffon engines have long since been scrapped, broken down into component parts, melted back into raw aluminum and steel. The men who flew them, who engineered them, who made the strategic decisions around them, are almost entirely gone. The world has moved on to wars fought with missiles and satellites, guided by algorithms rather than human intuition. But the knowledge persists. The brief exchange between Japanese innovation and British adaptation, the accidental transmission of technical superiority from a dying nation to its enemy, remains embedded in the historical record, waiting to be rediscovered by those who know how to read the archives. In 2019, a graduate student named Sophia Okonkwo was researching the evolution of aircraft engine design across the 20th century when she encountered David Chen's 2011 paper. She read Eleanor Hartwell's original unpublished manuscript. She traced the genealogy of the Sakai engine through technical databases and metallurgical literature. She eventually traveled to Japan to conduct interviews with descendants of Yamamoto's family, though by then none of them had knowledge of his final mission or its accidental consequences. Okonkwo's dissertation, completed in 2022, was titled Unintended Vectors: How Enemy Innovation Shapes Allied Technology in Wartime. It has been cited by 7 subsequent academic works and remains relatively unknown outside scholarly circles. The fundamental question that Okonkwo posed in her research remains unanswered. Would the Sakai engine have made a difference if Japan could have produced it in quantity? Would the air war have extended longer? Would the outcome have fundamentally changed? The historical consensus is that it would not have. By 1943-1944, Japan's industrial capacity was already fatally compromised. Even if the Sakai engine had been mass-produced, the broader collapse of Japanese air power was inevitable. The engine represented a technological solution to a strategic problem that technology alone could not solve. And yet, the question persists. History is constructed not only from events that actually occurred, but from the counterfactuals that never materialized, the roads not taken, the technologies not deployed, the moments when slight variations in circumstance might have altered everything. Takeshi Yamamoto died carrying specifications for an engine that might have changed nothing. Instead, it changed something. This paradox is perhaps the most honest truth about warfare, that intention and outcome are rarely aligned, that sacrifice is often accidental, and that the consequences of any single act ripple outward in directions that cannot be predicted or controlled. His name does not appear in the major histories of World War II. No biography has been written about his life. His widow's grave has no marker indicating that she was the widow of a man whose death inadvertently accelerated his nation's defeat. His family today, if any descendants remain, has no knowledge of his final mission or the briefcase that he died trying to protect. He was simply one more casualty in a war that killed 60 million people. His specificity has been absorbed into that enormous statistic. The fact that his death produced a particular technical consequence is known only to the historians patient enough to follow the archival trail, to read the unsealed folders, to connect the fragments of documentation scattered across decades and institutions. The Rolls-Royce Griffon engine remained in production until the late 1950s. Some variants powered post-war aircraft well into the 1970s. The innovations derived from the Sakai specifications became so thoroughly integrated into the standard design that their origins disappeared entirely. By the time the last Griffon engine rolled off the assembly line, no one building them knew they were constructing machines that carried within their geometry the intellectual inheritance of a Japanese officer who had died attempting to preserve his nation's technological secrets. The aero engines sit in museums now, in collections at the Imperial War Museum in London, the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, aviation museums in Tokyo and Berlin. They are beautiful objects, precise in their engineering, each one a testament to human ingenuity and industrial capability. They speak to no one who passes by. Their internal logic, the ancestry of their design, the accident that shaped their evolution, the dead man whose failure enabled their success, is entirely silent. This is perhaps the most melancholic truth about technical history. The machines do not remember, the steel does not speak. The knowledge is preserved only in archives and in the minds of historians who take the time to read what has been written and to acknowledge what has been lost. Takeshi Yamamoto's briefcase was empty when it was recovered from the wreckage. The documents inside were saturated with salt water, some pages illegible. But enough remained to be translated, to be analyzed, to be understood by men in laboratories on the other side of the world. He succeeded in dying. He failed in his mission. And in that failure, he changed the course of the air war in ways that he would never know. The rain fell on Japanese airfields through the summer of 1944 and into the final months of 1945. The new engines that might have changed everything were never built in sufficient quantity. The technological advantage that Yamamoto fought to preserve became instead the technological foundation of his enemy's aircraft. The war ended. The steel was melted down. The men who built it and flew it aged and died. The knowledge persisted, filed away in archives, waiting for someone curious enough to open the folder and read what had been written. And if anyone ever does read it, the only honest response is the one that Richard Hartley wrote in his journal 79 years ago. "The enemy has shown us something we needed to see. It is difficult to feel grateful for this knowledge, and yet gratitude is perhaps the only honest response." Dune, the aero engines do not remember, but perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the archive itself is the memorial. Subscribe to our channel to explore more cases and curiosities from World War II. Thank you for following the story. See you in the next video.